There are a number of theories of visual perception, but we are only going to focus on 3 in this class: psychological, GESTALT, and semiotics. Psychological theories. This is essentially saying we see what we want to see. So messages that are in accord with our already established biases, preferences, and points of reference tend to be perceived or selected more often than those that are not in accord. Individuals tend to select messages consistent with their interests, their attitudes, beliefs, personal values, and their psychological makeup. So think about how some people will only watch super liberal news or super conservative news, and that is explained by this psychological theory, which is that they want to hear what they want to hear because it does not go against what they already believe. Viewers also retain this kind of information in the memory longer, research shows. So an individual selects information that's deemed worthwhile, relevant, as well as easy to process, and that is generally in tune with their past experiences. Cultural experiences. Cultural expectations are particularly relevant to making meaning from visual messages. An expectation can be thought of as a picture that an individual has in their mind about what they expect to encounter. So take this seminal study as an example. Way back in 1957, Bagby examined, I don't remember the first name, but Bagby examined cultural influence on perception in an experiment of binocular rivalry. These kinds of experiments require a participant to wear binoculars with differing images in each lens, and one of the images will become more dominant. In this experiment, 12 Americans and 12 Mexicans were asked to wear these devices in which one lens contained an image of Mexican culture and one lens contained an image of American culture. Afterward, when questioned about what they saw, the Mexican participants tended to see their own cultures more frequently than the Americans. And of course, the Americans tended to see their own culture more frequently as well. Attitude. Attitude is also a relevant concept in perception. Of course, I'm using the Gamecocks as an example visually here, but back in 1954, there was a study by Hastorf and Cantrill that involved a controversial football game in which key players from both Princeton and Dartmouth received a serious injury. The game was shown to 2 groups, one from Dartmouth and one from Princeton. And as you might imagine, the Dartmouth students saw about half as many infractions by their own team as by Princeton, despite the fact that they were shown the same game. So in other words, their attitudes influenced their visual perception. An experiment using hypnosis demonstrated that mood also has an effect on perception. So in 1945, Luba and Lucas hypnotized subjects, and then they suggested to them that they were experiencing a certain mood. They then asked them to tell what they saw in a picture. Each subject was put in a happy mood and then shown six pictures. Then the subject was told to forget the pictures and what had been said about them and was put in a critical mode. So happy, then critical, and then shown these same pictures. And finally, they were given the same treatment once more, except for they were suggested that they were in an anxious mood through hypnosis. The descriptions of the pictures were drastically different depending on the mood that the person was in. They differed not only in the train of thought the pictures suggested, but also in the details that they noticed. All right, so one picture that they were shown showed young people digging in a swampy area. And this, by the way, is not that exact picture. I could not find that exact picture, but it is a close enough example for here. So young people digging in a swampy area. And here's one subject's description of that picture while they were put in that happy mood through hypnosis. They said, "It looks fun. Reminds me of summer. That's what life is for, working out in the open, really living. Digging in the dirt, planting, watching things grow." And then here is that same subject, but they were given the critical mood through hypnosis. They said, "Pretty horrible land. There ought to be something more useful for kids of that age to do, instead of digging in that stuff. It's filthy and dirty and good for nothing." And then finally, when they were in the anxious mood, they said, "They're going to get hurt or cut. There should be someone older there who knows what to do in case of an accident. I wonder how deep the water is." So you can see mood, at least according to this study, and follow-up studies as well, but this was the seminal study, does indeed affect what we see and how we feel about what we see. So that's all we're going to touch on in terms of psychological theories, but you get the basic idea, which is that overall we kind of see what we want to see, and our backgrounds, our moods, attitudes, and so on really have an influence on how we see and what we see. So let's move on to Gestalt theory. And if you know anything about Gestalt, if you've heard that term at all, you probably know the explanation that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. And that's really it in a nutshell, but there's more to it. It's about how we are inclined to group items and see them as a whole rather than individual parts. We want to connect objects or shapes to each other, and when we do this, it forms new shapes in our mind that are, again, the sum of those individual parts. There are 4 principles of Gestalt theory, and there are also 4 what I'll call elements, and we'll talk about both of these. So the first principle of Gestalt is emergence, and this is where the human brain forms an object from a pattern. So we do this as children when we look at faces, look for faces, or animals and cloud formations. I remember doing that a lot. I can't do it as well anymore now for some reason. But here we see another example of emergence used deliberately in an image. So the tiger is not obvious at first, but it emerges from the image. And once you see it, it's pretty much, you see it permanently. The second principle is multi-stability. So this is Rubens' vase. You've probably seen it. So negative space can lead the viewer's eye where you want it to go or trick it into seeing a hidden message. Concentrate on the the dark object in the middle of the picture and you will see a vase. But of course, if you concentrate on the black negative, on the white negative space for a little while, you will begin to see the faces looking at each other. And you may find that it jumps between the two. Vase, faces, vase, faces. That's multi-stability in action. All right, the next principle is called invariance. And this is the ability of the human brain to recognize an object even when it's viewed in different conditions. So like different angles, different colors, maybe different line qualities, but we can still tell that it's the same object. And finally, the fourth principle is reification. And this is related to figure-ground relationships, and we're going to talk about that more very soon, actually in the next slide. So you might see here an E, the letter E, but if you look at what's called the ground, the white part, you might see a spoon and an egg. And this is used a lot in graphic design to create logos, really clever logos. We'll also talk about that more. So figure-ground relationships in Gestalt. So if you look up here at this image, this is similar, of course, to the vase. You might see chess pieces or you might see people. And you will probably see the pieces first. So here's some principles of why that is and of figure-ground relationships in visual perception. So figures have boundaries and grounds don't. Figures tend to be perceived as closer or nearer than the ground. The figures, in this case the pieces, have shape and form, but the grounds don't. It's implied. We tend to see shapes that are symmetrical first, and we don't see them simultaneously. It's kind of a back and forth thing. But yeah, we tend to see the figures before we see the grounds, and you probably did that in this case. And now let's talk about the elements of Gestalt. And by the way, the terms principles versus elements, those are just terms that I am using. And if you look this stuff up online, you might see things like laws or theories and that type of thing. But I'm referring to this as the elements of Gestalt, the 4 elements. And you'll see other elements online, but these are the 4 we are going to talk about in this class. So there's proximity, which says we perceive objects that are close together as belonging to the same group. The element of similarity. So our minds tend to group things that have similar properties, such as similar colors or similar shapes. Continuity. Our minds will continue a pattern beyond its ending points. We'll have an example of this. And then closure, we tend to mentally fill in visual gaps so that we can see a whole form. Let's take a look at this example. Do you see here columns or do you see rows? Probably columns. So why do we see columns? And according to what principle of Gestalt? And if you're thinking it's the principle of, the element of similarity, that's correct. So the squares are similar and the circles are similar, and that's why we group them into columns. All right, let's look at this one. Same question. Do you tend to see columns or do you tend to see rows? And what element of Gestalt is that a result of? So I'm definitely seeing columns, and you probably are too, unless you're overthinking it. And that, I think, would be explained by the element of proximity, right? So the circles in the columns are closer together or closer in proximity than the circles in the rows. And that's why we see this as sort of like each column being an object almost. So that's part of Gestalt, right? The parts make up a whole. All right, and one last example. What do you see here? Most likely you see rows, and I will let you think about what element of Gestalt explains that. What element of Gestalt do you see here in action? So this demonstrates the element of closure. The panda here from the WWF logo is not fully formed. There's openness. Excuse me, goodness. But our minds fill that in. So we definitely see a panda, even though really it's just a series of shapes that don't necessarily look like a panda at all. Same with this image of a soccer ball. I'm sure you saw a soccer ball, even though it is just some pentagrams. Oh gosh, now I'm going to not say that correctly. But anyway, it's just a series of of shapes here. But you see a soccer ball because your brain fills that in. And of course, same here, just some lines, but your brain will fill in the gaps to see a form of a person. So what are the implications of Gestalt for design? Gestalt principles and elements can and should influence designers when they're establishing visual hierarchy. And visual hierarchy refers to directing a viewer's eye in a specific sequence. So if you want people to see one thing first and then another second and so on, that's visual hierarchy, and we'll be talking about that more later. But the implications here, so there's a concept of visual weight. And visual weight means that something that is heavier visually is what we tend to see first, and it's influenced by size, shape, location, tone, and interest. So just a few examples. So larger shapes are heavier than smaller shapes. Irregular shapes are heavier than regular shapes. Isolated shapes are heavier than several grouped shapes. So if something is kind of out there on its own, you might see it first. Darker tones are heavier in visual weight than lighter tones, and shapes with intrinsic interest, so maybe shocking or unusual elements, tend to be visually heaviest. As I mentioned, many of the best logos make use of figure-ground relationships to communicate more than one idea in a single mark. So here are some kind of common, basic examples of figure-ground relationships. So you can see here, of course, you might see a wrench and a house, and that was probably a logo for like a home construction or fix-it company type of thing. Here we see a key and a city, and so on, a W and an F here. And when we get to a section on logos specifically, we'll see so many more of these. And these are my favorite kinds of logos, because when you see the little hidden meaning, it's just very rewarding as a visual communicator. All right, so most likely you've seen this FedEx logo before, and you may have not seen the arrow. Although at this point that's fairly common, so you may have. But that's just another sort of classic example of figure-ground relationships in a logo. Principles of Gestalt are all throughout graphic design to juxtapose meanings. So here we see a squiggle, basic line, and here you see an advertisement for a paternity testing company, and I think you get the meaning. Finally, the last visual perception theory that we're going to discuss is semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs, and it was defined by one of its founders, the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, as the study of the life of signs within society. A sign is a basic unit of language. The signified and the signifier comprise a sign. In other words, a sign is made up of a signified and a signifier. And this gets a little hard to digest, but we'll keep talking about it, and I think you'll understand it pretty easily. So the signified is the meaning, the concept. What are we trying to communicate? And the signifier is the sound or the image or the mark that is attached to the signified. So you might see a stop sign, that's the signifier, and the signified is stop, like don't go anymore, pause in your car. And that makes up together that signified and the signifier makes up the sign. Charles Sanders Peirce was also a seminal scholar in the field of semiotics, and he defined a sign as something which stands for something to somebody. Not difficult to understand at all. He also developed the idea of the icon, the index, and the symbol. So these being different kinds of signs. All right, so to Charles Sanders Peirce, signs can be iconic, indexical, or symbolic. An icon is obvious. That resembles what it is trying to signify. It's not something you really have to learn. This is comprised of pictures, illustrations, photographs. So if I'm trying to communicate the idea of a tree, I'll draw a tree. If I'm trying to communicate a landscape, I might take a picture of a landscape. That's an icon. That's the most obvious and sort of easy to understand type of sign, according to Charles Sanders Peirce. And then there's an index. Now this suggests a connection. So it's subtle. To me, this is honestly one of the more difficult ones to come up with examples for, but the one that I always go to is ashes would be an index for fire, or a sign of fire. So if we see ashes, we know that there has been a fire. So I'd like you to think of other examples as well. I always have to rack my brain, but that's a good one, and if I were to give a test question, that would be the one I would give. And then finally, a sign of symbols. These have to be learned. All right, so these are not obvious at all. They are not even suggested at all. They are cultural. They are something that you may not know until somebody teaches you. For example, if we look at this squiggly line here, we know that that's the letter S. Why? Because when we were in preschool, somebody taught us that that's the letter S, and it goes S. So letters of the alphabet, those are symbols, and a star, we might learn, connotes a sheriff, or it can be a Jewish symbol as well, when it's a certain kind of star, of course. So those are things that if somebody doesn't teach us, we wouldn't know. And then Roland Barthes, scholar Roland Barthes, conceptualized the idea, sorry about that, of denotation and connotation. So we've looked at Charles Sanders Peirce, we have looked at, here we looked at Saussure, and then we are looking at Barthes. And these are all just scholars that come up with different ways to explain signs or semiotics. So Barthes, again, he talks about denotation and connotation. So as an example of how these go together, think of the word gritty. And the definition of gritty is having a rough texture. So in a literal sense, we might say this sandpaper is gritty, or this wall is gritty. And that's denotation. It denotes roughness, right? But think about this sentence. That side of town is gritty. Right? So in that sense, we're not saying that the section of the city has a rough texture in a literal sense. Instead, we're saying it's a tough neighborhood. Maybe it has issues related to crime and poverty. So it's gritty. It is a connotation. What other words can you think of that have a denotation and a connotation? So think of the word salty. Only somewhat recently did that come to mean you're like bitter about something, or you were, you all know what salty is in terms of a connotation. And of course the denotation is, having a lot of actual salt on your food or whatever. But you might say, I'm really salty about this bad grade I got on the test. So those are examples of denotation and connotation. So let's do a quick semiotic analysis of a photograph. And scholars do this all the time. And you can write a whole 20-page paper about a single photograph or painting or something that you examine using semiotics to try and glean meaning from a photo. And this is an older example. This is at least 10 years old at this point. And let me go ahead and read the caption to you while you look at the picture. Bobby Dunford, 72, looks at the damage to his neighbor's house in Pulaski, Virginia on April 9th, after a tornado ripped through the Pulaski and Draper areas of Pulaski County the night before. Bobby, whose house was also damaged, was able to help save his neighbor, Sarah Edwards, with the help of another neighbor. I was standing at the front door with my wife, and I told Sarah to get inside. I threw my wife on the floor, and here it came. It just lasted about 10 seconds. Me and a neighbor kicked in the back door of Sarah's house. She was in her bedroom, thank God. It was the only room in the house that had that the roof stayed on. It's a miracle. So when you do a semiotic analysis of an image, and by the way, it's much more typical to do this to a painting than a journalistic photo, but this one has so much symbolism that I really like using this one. The first thing you're going to do is describe the image. There's not going to be any interpretation. You're not going to try to glean any meaning. You are just going to see what you see. And scholar Jillian Rose, who also teaches on semiotic analysis, says to look and look again at the image at this point. So what is there? What about the focal point? The composition, the colors. You might also look at the style. Is this art? Is this a photograph? Is it photojournalism? And depending on what kind of analysis you're doing, you might also look at technique like exposure and depth of field and lighting. For our purposes, just to get a feel for a semiotic analysis, let's focus on the details, so the black text here. I put some other stuff here just as examples, but in this picture I am seeing a lot of stuff. I'm seeing gloves and a fan and a clenched fist, bricks and a hat and a light bulb. We see the room and the doorway and a missing roof and so on. And you could go on and on and on and come up with a number of things. And if you were doing a semiotic analysis, you probably would. And then you try and think about, all right, what do these things mean? What could they mean? And you might go into history and look at literature about what this stuff might mean in certain cultures and in your culture and so on. But, oh, my text got a little off kilter there. Sorry about that. But, so the glove, I might say, you know, that connotes, if I'm using Barth's, I might say that's work and help, labor. So if we're using Barth's denotation and connotation, the glove is the denotation, and the stuff over here in the right column is a connotation. What does it mean? And if we're doing Saussure, we would say that the sign, the signified is this over here, and the signifier is the glove. And together they make the sign. And then we have the cross. Well, that could connote Christianity and hope, faith, religion. And of course it would depend on who's looking at this. It might mean something entirely different to a different person. The fan, it's kind of hanging on there. Not very strongly connected because there's no roof. And it also is missing a blade. Well, we might say, you know, it's kind of hanging on by a thread. And again, we could go on and on and on. And you can think of your own things if you want to. But let's kind of wrap that up, and you can think about this image and what the elements mean to you and do your own little semiotic analysis. And as we wrap up, let's take a look at this picture here. So this is the January insurrection of the Capitol. And depending on who is looking at this photograph, You see a lot of things and they mean a lot of things. So what do you see in this image, and what are the connotations to you? And how might it differ to a different person? I see a person pointing. I see some signs. I see the American flag. I see some of that bright yellow clothing, and so on. All right, I'm going to leave you with that. And then I also want you to think of other symbols that might have different meanings to different people. What about the American flag? What about the Confederate flag? Okay, we're going to end on that. Let you do some thinking on your own. And that wraps up our small section on visual perception theories.